September 11th, 2001. Two towers turned to dust. A hole in the Pentagon, a field in Pennsylvania scarred by a crater. Nearly 3,000 Americans dead in the span of a morning. Within hours, the story was told. 19 hijackers, directed by Osama bin Laden from a cave in Afghanistan, outwitted the most advanced defense system in the world and changed history forever. But what if the story was not that simple? Why were there so many trails of evidence buried, ignored, or quietly erased? Why were there warnings that were missed, drills conveniently evaded, profits made in advance, and the aftermath so perfectly aligned with agendas laid out before the attack? 20 plus years later, one question still hangs in the air. Was 9/11 just a terrorist attack or an inside job? The 9/11 Commission report became the definitive account. Hijacked planes caused catastrophic building collapses. Fires brought down World Trade Center 7. Intelligence failures were tragic but innocent, and America was blindsided. But this official story has been challenged even by members of the commission itself. Commissioner Max Cleland resigned, calling it a national scandal and accusing the White House of obstruction. Another, John Farmer, later admitted, at some level of the government, at some point in time, there was an agreement not to tell the truth. If the official version was trustworthy, why did its own authors lose faith? The story that 9/11 was a random occurrence collapses when you see the mountain of warnings. Israeli Mossad passed information to the U.S. intelligence in August 2001 that hundreds of operatives were inside of America preparing for a major assault. German D&D reports warned of hijacked pilots. Russian intelligence confirmed that they told the U.S. about suicide pilots planning to strike. The Egyptian president later stated that his services delivered warnings that planes were to be used in these attacks. Even within the U.S., FBI agents like Colin Rowley and Harry Samet flagged Middle Eastern men taking suspicious flight training, eager to fly, but uninterested in learning how to land. Their warnings were completely ignored. This wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was an avalanche of red flags deliberately brushed aside. The eerie coincidences deepen on the day itself. Two employees of the Israeli messaging service, Odigo, received warnings just hours before the attacks, then passed them on to the FBI. The warnings didn't mention New York specifically, but the timing is too sharp to dismiss. Then, 5 men later dubbed the Dancing Israelis were arrested after being seen filming and allegedly celebrating the burning towers. They worked for Urban Moving Systems, a New Jersey moving company that later suspected of acting as a front for Israeli intelligence. In their van, thousands in cash, multiple passports, and a box cutter. They were detained, questioned, and then deported. Officially, they were cleared, but FBI documents confirmed the arrest and the strange circumstances. For conspiracy researchers, this wasn't just some odd behavior. It was the smoking trail of Mossad surveillance operations around 9/11. Meanwhile, connections to America's supposed allies are impossible to ignore, and they form one of the murkiest parts of the 9/11 story. On the very morning of the attacks, former President George H.W. Bush was attending a Carlyle Group conference in Washington. Sitting in the same room were members of the bin Laden family, who had millions of dollars invested in Carlyle, a private equity firm with deep ties to the defense industry. Carlyle stood to benefit enormously from the surge in military spending that followed 9/11. And it did. In the months after, Carlyle's defense portfolio skyrocketed in value. Though the bin Ladens eventually did withdraw their investments due to bad optics, the timing and overlap between the Bushes, the bin Ladens, and the defense sector should raise profound questions about conflicts of interest. In the days after the attacks, when ordinary Americans were grounded and stranded, dozens of Saudis, including at least 24 members of the bin Laden family, were quietly flown out of the country. Most were never properly questioned by the FBI. The justification was that they were in danger of mob retaliation. But to skeptics, it looked more like a cover-up, ensuring that individuals who might have known something were quickly removed from the U.S. soil. Then there's the shadow of Pakistan's powerful intelligence service, the ISI. Reports surfaced that General Mohammed Ahmed, the head of the ISI, had authorized a $100,000 wire transfer to Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker. This wasn't even a rumor. It was reported by outlets like the Wall Street Journal and the Times of India. Even more disturbing, General Ahmed was in Washington that week, meeting with top U.S. officials, including members of the CIA and State Department, as the attacks unfolded. Yet this explosive detail somehow vanished almost immediately from the mainstream narrative. And then there were the infamous 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report, which were classified for over a decade. When finally released in 2016, they suggested that Saudi government officials in California had provided direct assistance to some of the hijackers, including helping them with housing and finances. The Saudis have obviously denied involvement, but the U.S. government kept those pages secret for years. If there was truly nothing to hide, why even bury the evidence? Taken together, these details paint a picture that is difficult to ignore. The Bush dynasty is deeply intertwined with the Carlyle and Saudi Arabia business interests. The bin Laden family was flown out of the U.S. without scrutiny. The head of Pakistan's intelligence service linked to a financial transfer to the lead hijacker, while simultaneously being in Washington. And classified pages hinting at state sponsorship of hijackers from one of America's closest oil allies exist. The official narrative is that 9/11 is solely pinned on Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. But when you trace the connections, it's not the caves of Afghanistan that keep showing up. It's Washington, it's Riyadh, and Islamabad. 1 year before 9/11, the Project for the New American Century published Rebuilding America's Defenses. In it, they admitted that their version of U.S. global dominance would be slow, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. Its members included Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, men who would run America's response to 9/11. After the attacks, their blueprint was enacted. Massive increases in defense spending, preemptive wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the establishment of a permanent war on terror. Cheney's former company, Halliburton, reaped billions in contracts. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman saw their stock values explode. The new Pearl Harbor had arrived, and the defense industry was ready. In July 2001, Larry Silverstein signed a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center. His insurance policy covered terrorism. After the attacks, he pursued litigation, arguing the two plane strikes were separate events, potentially doubling his payouts. In the end, he secured billions in settlements. His PBS interview, where he said they decided to pull it regarding to World Trade Center 7, only fueled speculation. He later clarified that he meant pulling firefighters out, not demolition. But conspiracy theorists weren't convinced. The Pentagon strike remains one of the most debated aspects of 9/11, not because it happened at the very heart of America's military machine. According to the official story, American Airlines airplane Flight 77, a Boeing 757, slammed into the western side of the Pentagon at over 500 miles per hour, killing 125 people inside. But for many, the evidence doesn't match the explanation. Unlike other high-speed plane crashes, photographs from the scene showed remarkably little visible wreckage. Most images from that day show a small hole in the facade, roughly 16 to 20 feet wide, with no sign of massive wings or a tail section. Later photos did show some scattered debris, but skeptics argue it was minimal for a jetliner that large. Officials claim the plane had been vaporized in the heat of that explosion, a claim that many aviation experts consider implausible. Adding to the mystery, security camera footage released years later offered only few frames, none of which clearly showed a Boeing 757. The impact zone itself only deepens the suspicion. The plane struck the one section of the Pentagon that was under renovation, meaning it had fewer staff than normal. Among those who died were Defense Department accountants and auditors, the very personnel investigating the financial irregularities in the Pentagon spending. And here lies one of the most chilling coincidences. On September 10, 2001, just one day before the attacks, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld held a press conference admitting that the Pentagon could not account for $2.3 trillion in spending. That story alone should have been front-page news for weeks, if not months, yet it was instantly buried by the following day's tragedy. Many of the very offices and people involved in untangling that missing money were wiped out in the strike. Even more unsettling are the reports of the military drills happening that day. Just as NORAD was simulating hijacked planes, some Pentagon staff were conducting emergency exercises, leading to the confusion about whether the crash was a part of a drill or a real attack. To conspiracy researchers, this convergence is too convenient. So we're left with questions that have never been fully answered. Why did a plane strike the precise offices auditing missing trillions? Why was there so little clear wreckage for a jetliner of that size? Why has the Pentagon only ever released a handful of blurry security frames instead of dozens of camera angles that surely existed around one of the most secure buildings on Earth? Coincidence? Incompetence? or something much darker, a cover-up hidden in plain sight. In the days before 9/11, Wall Street saw a spike in put options against United and American Airlines. Academic studies confirmed that these trades were statistically abnormal, consistent with foreknowledge. The SEC investigated, but later declared no link to terrorism. So if Al-Qaeda wasn't profiting from the stock market, who was? On the morning of 9/11, NORAD was running Vigilant Guardian, simulating hijacked planes. When the real thing happened, some initially thought it was still part of the exercise. Officials said the drill increased readiness. Skeptics argue it provided cover for chaos. FEMA, oddly, was already in New York on September 10th for a bioterror drill. And 6 months earlier, Fox aired The Lone Gunman Pilot, where a government faction hijacks a plane remotely and tries to crash it into the World Trade Center. What are the odds? The Twin Towers fell at a near free-fall speed, with much of their concrete reduced to a fine dust that blanketed the entirety of Lower Manhattan. Even more baffling to many was the collapse of World Trade Center 7, a 47-story steel skyscraper that was never even struck by a plane. It fell straight down into its own footprint, in what looked like, to the untrained eye, a textbook demolition. The National Institute of Standards and Technology maintains that an uncontrolled office fire and structural damage triggered a progressive failure. But thousands of architects, engineers, and demolition experts argue that the speed, symmetry, and nature of the collapse bear all the hallmarks of a controlled demolition. Adding to the suspicion are the testimonies of first responders who were inside those very buildings. Firefighters and police officers described hearing explosions in basements, lobbies, and upper floors, sometimes minutes before the towers even fell. Some reported feeling shockwaves rippling through the structure, yet these consistent accounts were largely excluded or downplayed in official reports. For critics, the omission is telling. If the evidence that pointed towards explosions didn't fit the official narrative, it was simply ignored. The anomalies surrounding 9/11 pile up in ways that cannot be easily explained. Beneath the Twin Towers sat a vault holding an estimated $200 million in gold and precious metals. Some of it was recovered weeks later, but reports suggested that a portion of it randomly vanished without a trace. It was stolen in the chaos, or was something else going on underground that day? Even stranger is the case of Muhammad Atta's passport. Amid an inferno hot enough to weaken steel and turn concrete into dust, a paper passport was found intact near Ground Zero, a discovery so convenient it seems almost theatrical. Then there were the phone calls from the passengers aboard the planes. Some family members reported conversations with loved ones using cell phones at a cruising altitude. But in 2001, cell technology simply didn't allow for consistent calls above 30,000 feet. Later explanations shifted, suggesting that the airphones were used, but the early reports have fueled endless speculation. Perhaps the most disturbing are the testimonies of firefighters, police officers, and civilians who described multiple explosions inside the towers before their collapse. Some reported blasts in basements and lobbies minutes before the planes hit. Others recalled secondary booms rippling throughout the buildings as they fell. Officials dismissed these as noises from structural failures or fuel ignitions, but the consistency in these accounts, captured on video and radio transmissions, has kept the debate alive. Each anomaly, taken alone, might be brushed off as coincidence or confusion, but when considered together, they form a pattern, one that suggests the official story is missing more than just a few details. The Patriot Act was rushed through Congress in October 2001, only weeks after the attacks, granting sweeping new surveillance powers to law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Provisions that had long been on wish lists for the FBI and NSA were suddenly law. From warrantless wiretaps to secret searches and indefinite detention, the framework for a modern surveillance state was put into place almost overnight. At the same time, wars began in Afghanistan and Iraq, both framed as necessary responses to 9/11. In reality, these invasions aligned with long-planned strategic ideas. Afghanistan for its geopolitical position, and Iraq for its oil reserves and regime change on behalf of Israel. Defense contractors like Halliburton, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin raked in trillions over the following decades, while oil giants gained access to lucrative contracts and resources. The NSA's PRISM program, revealed years later by Edward Snowden, expanded global surveillance under the banner of counterterrorism, scooping up phone records, emails, and internet activity from millions of ordinary people. The result was clear. Americans lost freedoms, elites consolidated power, and the Middle East was plunged into chaos that still reverberates today. So was 9/11 an inside job? At the very least, it was an attack allowed to happen. a catastrophic failure of the world's most advanced intelligence infrastructure that just happened to align perfectly with the geopolitical ambitions of America's ruling class. At its worst, it was something far darker, a deliberately orchestrated event by rogue elements within the state, carried out to manufacture consent for endless war, mass surveillance, and a restructuring of the world order. In the months and years leading up to the attacks, explicit warnings were given. Foreign intelligence agencies, whistleblowers, and even FBI field officers raised alarms. But those red flags were systematically ignored, sidelined, or buried. Key figures were promoted instead of investigated. The official story conveniently omits details that challenge the narrative. The mysterious collapse of World Trade Center 7, the financial transactions pointing to foreknowledge, the miraculous survival of paper passports in a fire that supposedly melted steel, and the instant mobilization of long-prepared legislation like the Patriot Act. Meanwhile, the trail of money and influence leads to the usual suspects: defense contractors, oil conglomerates, Wall Street banks, and political dynasties, who all stood to benefit from the chaos. The wars that followed, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and beyond, generated trillions in revenue, redefined global alliances, and ushered in a new era of perpetual conflict. Constitutional rights were stripped away. Privacy was sacrificed, and an entire generation grew up under the shadow of fear of authoritarianism. Evidence vanished, voices were silenced, questions were dismissed as conspiracy. Yet the pattern remains, one of selective blindness, criminal negligence, and stunning opportunism. The truth may never be fully revealed, but one question pierces through the smokescreen. Who benefited from you believing the official story? Because America's greatest enemies don't always hide in caves overseas. Sometimes they wear suits, they sit in boardrooms and operate behind screens of the intelligence community, or profit from every new conflict under the banner of national security. And in the wake of this tragedy, they don't grieve, they consolidate power. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. Leave a comment, like, and subscribe. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. God bless.